Hey there, seekers of the unknown. Before we plunge into this tale of shadows and secrets, drop a comment below sharing where you're reading from. Now, let's embark on this perilous journey into the heart of darkness. The wind howled through the jagged peaks of the Carpathian Mountains as I navigated the winding dirt road toward Ponari Castle. It was October 18, 2025, and the autumn leaves swirled like restless spirits around my rented SUV. My name is Elena Voss, a 35-year-old investigative journalist from Berlin, Germany. For the past decade, I'd made a name for myself chasing stories that mainstream media dismissed as folklore or fantasy. Werewolves in the Black Forest, witches in the Bavarian Alps, ghosts haunting the ruins of Cold War bunkers. I'd interviewed them all, or at least the ones willing to talk. My reputation in those shadowy circles was built on one principle: listen without judgment, record without exaggeration, and protect sources at all costs. This invitation, however, felt different. It had arrived via an encrypted email 2 weeks ago from an anonymous sender. Ms. Voss, it read, your work on supernatural entities has caught my attention. I have a story that spans millennia, one that could redefine humanity's understanding of history. Meet me at Ponari Castle, Transylvania, Romania, on the full moon of October. Come alone. Bring no electronic devices beyond a mechanical flashlight and a notebook. Discretion is mandatory. No signature, just coordinates and a warning. Failure to comply will result in silence eternal. Ponari Castle, or what remained of it, was perched on a sheer cliff overlooking the Arges River. Infamous as the real fortress of Vlad the Impaler, the historical figure who inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula, it had been abandoned for centuries, its stone walls crumbling under the weight of time and legend. Tourists rarely ventured here. The trek was too treacherous, the aura too foreboding. As I parked at the base of the 1,480-step staircase leading up to the ruins, I felt a familiar thrill mixed with unease. This wasn't my first rodeo with the undead, but vampires. They were the elite of the supernatural world, elusive, powerful, and notoriously unforgiving. I slung my backpack over my shoulder containing only the essentials: a wind-up flashlight, a leather-bound notebook, several pens, a silver crucifix just in case, and a wooden stake disguised as a walking stick. No phone, no recorder per the instructions. The climb took nearly an hour, my breath coming in ragged puffs as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bloody hues. By the time I reached the top, night had fully descended, and the castle loomed like a skeletal giant against the starlit sky. The entrance was a gaping archway, its iron gates long rusted away. As I stepped across the threshold, a sudden chill enveloped me, sharper than the mountain air. My flashlight beam pierced the darkness, illuminating dust-laden corridors and collapsed ceilings. Cobwebs draped like funeral shrouds, and the air smelled of damp stone and decay. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing unnaturally. "I'm Elena Voss. I'm here as requested." Silence greeted me at first, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. Then, from the depths of the great hall ahead, a voice emerged, smooth, resonant, laced with an accent that hinted at ancient tongues. "Ms. Voss, your punctuality is appreciated. Enter the hall if you please. Third arch on your right." I followed the direction, my boots crunching on debris. The great hall was vast, its vaulted ceiling partially caved in, allowing moonlight to filter through like silver spears. In the center, seated on a throne-like chair that seemed incongruously pristine amid the ruins, was a figure that made my heart skip. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored black suit that absorbed the light. His skin was pale as marble, his hair raven-black and swept back from a chiseled face. Eyes like stormy seas fixed on me, ancient and unblinking. This was no ordinary man. This was Viktor Dragomir, or so I assumed, the vampire who had summoned me. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to a smaller chair opposite him. A low table between us held a crystal decanter filled with a dark red liquid, wine or something else. "I am Viktor Dragomir. You may call me Victor. Your reputation precedes you, Fair, discreet, unafraid of the truth, no matter how dark. I sat carefully, pulling out my notebook. The pleasure is mine, Victor. Before we begin, do you wish for anonymity? Most of my sources do. He smiled, revealing teeth too sharp, too perfect. Names hold power, but mine has been whispered in fear for 3,000 years. Use it as you see fit. But first, allow me to dispel a myth. Forget the tales of bloodthirsty monsters in capes. If my kind were as Hollywood portrays, your species would have vanished eons ago. We are witnesses, guardians, sometimes executioners. The temperature dropped noticeably as he spoke, my breath visible in the air. I scribbled notes furiously, the pen scratching loudly in the stillness. So, what are you then? A protector? More than that, he replied, leaning forward. I have walked among empires, influenced kings and conquerors, averted catastrophes that would have ended civilization. But let's start at the beginning, shall we? As Victor began his tale, I felt the weight of history pressing down, unaware that this interview would soon turn from conversation to chaos. The moonlight streaming through the shattered roof of Ponari Castle's great hall cast Viktor Dragomir in an ethereal glow, his pale skin almost luminescent. His voice, steady and resonant, carried the weight of centuries as he leaned back in his throne-like chair, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crumbling walls. I gripped my pen tightly, my notebook open on my lap, ready to capture every word. The air grew colder, the shadows thicker, as if the castle itself were listening to his tale. I was born in a time when gods were as real to men as the earth beneath their feet, Victor began, his voice low, almost reverent. 3,000 years ago, in a village near what you now call the Black Sea, I was made, not born, into what I am. The details of my transformation are irrelevant, a ritual of blood and darkness best left forgotten. What matters is what came after, a life spent watching humanity rise, stumble, and nearly destroy itself, over and over. I scribbled quickly, my hands struggling to keep up. You said you influenced history. Can you give me specifics? Victor's lips curved into a faint, melancholic smile. Where to begin? The Trojan War, perhaps. You know the story, Helen, Paris, a decade-long siege. Your poets call it myth, but I was there, a shadow among the Greeks. The war wasn't just about a stolen queen, it was about power, trade routes, control of the Aegean. Agamemnon's generals planned to raze Troy to ash, to salt its fields so nothing would grow again. Total annihilation. He paused, his eyes meeting mine. I couldn't allow it. Troy's fall would have destabilized the region for centuries, crippled early trade and delayed the rise of Greece. So I whispered to Menelaus, to Odysseus over late-night councils. I spoke of legacy, of conquest with mercy, of a victory that preserved rather than eradicated. Troy fell, but its people were spared, its culture woven into Greece's. I wrote frantically, the enormity of his claim sinking in. You changed the outcome of the Trojan War. I nudged it, he corrected, his tone matter of fact. A conversation here, a suggestion there. Humanity makes its own choices, but I've learned how to tilt the scales. He shifted in his chair, the movement fluid, almost serpentine. Then came the plague of Justinian, 541 AD. Your historians call it one of the deadliest pandemics, wiping out half of Constantinople's population. They blame fleas, trade routes, poor sanitation. They're not wrong, but they miss the bigger picture. I had seen plagues before, patterns of disease tied to commerce, to grain stores crawling with rats. I moved through ports along the Mediterranean, burning infected warehouses, sinking ships before they could dock. In Alexandria, I orchestrated a quarantine of an entire district before the emperor's men even understood the threat. The church branded me a heretic. Of course, easier to call me demon than to explain epidemiology to a world that believed in divine wrath. My pen paused. You saved lives by burning warehouses. Lives, yes, thousands, but not without cost. Every fire I set displaced families, destroyed livelihoods. Every ship I sank drowned sailors who knew nothing of the cargo they carried. Choices, Elena, are never clean when the stakes are survival. The weight of his words settled over me, heavy as the castle's ancient stones. I swallowed, pushing forward. What about more recent history? The French Revolution you mentioned in your email. Victor's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as if peering into a painful memory. 1789. Paris was a powder keg, starvation, inequality, whispers of rebellion, but there was a darker force at play, a vampire, one of my own kind, named Livia. She was my companion for centuries, my confidant. His voice faltered, a rare crack in his composure. Livia saw the revolution as an opportunity, not for liberty, but for chaos. She infiltrated the Jacobins, whispered to Robespierre's allies, pushing for a bloodbath. Her plan was to poison Paris's water supply with a chemical toxin, a precursor to modern nerve agents. It would have killed thousands, turned the revolution into a slaughter that would destabilize Europe for decades. I stopped writing, my hand trembling. What did you do? I stopped her, he said simply, but his tone was ice. I tracked her to a hidden laboratory beneath the Tuileries Palace. We fought not with words, but with blades and fire. She was stronger than I expected, fueled by her own fanaticism. In the end, I drove a silver dagger through her heart. As she burned, she cursed me, called me a traitor to our kind. But I couldn't let her destroy Paris, not when it was the cradle of a new era. The silence that followed was suffocating. I forced myself to ask, and the Cold War? You mentioned it in your message. Victor stood, moving to a broken window where moonlight spilled like liquid silver. The Cold War was different. Humanity had learned to weaponize its own destruction on an unprecedented scale. Nuclear arsenals, biological experiments, chemical agents. Your species was no longer playing with swords but with annihilation. And my kind saw opportunity in that chaos. The Dark Council, we called them. 12 vampires, ancient and powerful, who believed humanity was too reckless to govern itself. They wanted to reshape the world, to cull its population and rule the survivors. Who were they? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Led by Ivan, my closest friend for a millennium. He was turned in the same era as I, during the fall of the Hittite Empire. We survived invasions, plagues, the rise and fall of Rome together. But by the 1950s, he had changed. He saw humanity's nuclear ambitions and believed they needed a master race, us, to survive. Ivan infiltrated Soviet research facilities, feeding scientists formulas for weaponized pathogens. Smallpox variants, anthrax strains, diseases that could wipe out continents. Others in the council worked with NATO, whispering of preemptive strikes, escalating tensions to spark a war that would leave only the worthy alive. I could barely breathe. You stopped them. I had no choice, Victor said, his voice hollow. Between 1955 and 1962, I hunted them. Ivan was the hardest. I found him in a bunker near Novosibirsk, overseeing a project to release a virus that would target specific genetic markers, ethnic cleansing on a global scale. We fought for hours, tearing through concrete and steel. He begged me to join him to see his vision of a better world. I refused. I drove a stake through his chest and watched him burn. 11 others followed, each one a piece of my soul lost. By the end, I was alone, the last of my kind in Europe. The air in the hall felt like a tomb, heavy with the weight of his confession. I scribbled, my hand shaking. Why did they turn against you? Because they believed humanity was a failed experiment, Victor said, turning back to me. They saw your wars, your greed, your willingness to destroy your own planet, and they decided you didn't deserve freedom. I disagreed. I believed, still believe, that humanity's flaws are what make it worth saving. But he trailed off, his eyes distant. But what? I pressed. Every century, you prove them right. Your laboratories now create viruses deadlier than anything Ivan dreamed of. Your weapons could end the world 100 times over. Your industries choke the air, poison the seas. I've spent millennia preventing your extinction, but I'm beginning to wonder if I've only delayed the inevitable. His words hung in the air, a chilling prophecy. Before I could respond, a low rumble shook the castle, dust cascading from the ceiling. Victor's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "We're not alone," he hissed. From the shadows beyond the hall I heard the unmistakable sound of movement, footsteps, too many, too fast, and too deliberate to be human. The rumble grew louder, vibrating through the ancient stones of Ponari Castle like the growl of an awakening beast. Dust and small pebbles rained from the cracked ceiling, and the moonlight seemed to dim as shadows writhed unnaturally along the walls. Viktor Dragomir was on his feet in an instant, his body a blur of motion that defied human physics. His eyes, those stormy seas, narrowed to slits as he scanned the darkness beyond the great hall. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his voice a sharp whisper laced with urgency. "They've found us." "Who?" I demanded, shoving my notebook into my backpack and gripping my wooden stake-walking stick. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins. I'd faced dangers before, aggressive spirits, territorial werewolves, but nothing like this. The air thickened with an oppressive presence, a metallic tang that reminded me of blood. "The remnants," Victor replied tersely, positioning himself between me and the entrance arches. "Survivors of the Dark Council or their acolytes. They've been hunting me since the Cold War. Your presence here must have drawn them out. They sense weakness in revelation." Before I could process his words, the shadows coalesced into forms. 5 figures emerged from the corridors, moving with the same unnatural grace as Victor. They were clad in dark cloaks that blended with the night, their faces pale masks of fury and hunger. The leader, a tall vampire with scarred features and glowing red eyes, stepped forward. His fangs gleamed in the moonlight. "Viktor Dragomir," he snarled, his accent thick with Eastern European inflections. "Traitor to our blood. You've hidden long enough, and you've brought a mortal pet, how quaint." Victor didn't flinch. "Lucian, I thought I ended your line in Prague, 1968. Persistent, aren't you?" Lucian laughed, a sound like shattering glass. "You ended nothing. The council lives on in us. We know what you've been whispering to this journalist, your pathetic confessions. Humanity's guardian, you're a fool. They deserve the cull we planned. And now we'll take your head and her life as tribute." The other vampires fanned out, encircling us. One was a wiry female with wild silver hair, another a burly male whose muscles rippled under his cloak. They hissed, their eyes locked on us like predators sizing up prey. I backed against the throne chair, my mind racing. This wasn't an interview anymore. It was a fight for survival. Victor glanced at me over his shoulder. "Elena, the backpack. There's a vial of holy water in the side pocket. I placed it there when you arrived. Use it wisely, and the crucifix around your neck, hold it high." I hadn't noticed the vial before. He must have slipped it in during our conversation. My fingers fumbled for it as the vampires lunged. The battle erupted in a whirlwind of speed and violence. Lucian struck first, blurring across the hall toward Victor. Their collision was like thunder, bodies slamming together with bone-cracking force. Victor countered with a swipe of his hand, claws extending from his fingers like razor blades. He raked across Lucian's chest, drawing black ichor that smoked on the stone floor. "You fight for a dead cause," Victor growled. The silver-haired female targeted me, her movements a deadly dance. She was upon me in seconds, her fangs bared inches from my throat. Panic surged, but instinct kicked in. I yanked the crucifix from my neck and thrust it forward. A burst of ethereal light erupted from the silver cross, searing her skin like acid. She screamed, recoiling as blisters formed on her face. "Witch," she spat. "Not a witch," I muttered, uncorking the holy water vial with trembling hands. "Just prepared." I splashed the liquid at her, and where it hit, her flesh sizzled and melted. She howled, staggering back, giving me a moment to grab my stake. Meanwhile, Victor was a force of nature. He grappled with Lucian, throwing him against a crumbling pillar that shattered on impact. Debris flew everywhere, and I ducked to avoid a flying stone. The burly vampire charged Victor from behind, but Victor anticipated it, twisting at impossible speed to drive his elbow into the attacker's jaw. The crack echoed through the hall, the vampire's head snapping back. But they were too many. A fourth vampire, sleek and agile, leaped onto Victor's back, sinking fangs into his shoulder. Victor roared in pain, black blood welling from the wound. He reached back, grabbed the assailant by the hair, and hurled him across the room into the fifth vampire, who was advancing on me. They collided in a tangle of limbs. "Elena now," Victor shouted. "The stake aim for the heart." The fifth vampire, a young-looking male with feral eyes, recovered quickly and pounced at me. I sidestepped, years of self-defense training from my investigative days paying off. As he overshot, I drove the wooden stake upward with all my strength. It pierced his chest, splintering ribs. He gasped, eyes widening in shock before his body convulsed and disintegrated into ash, the stake clattering to the ground. One down, but the silver-haired female was back, her burns healing unnaturally fast. She slashed at me with claws, tearing my jacket and grazing my arm. Pain flared, hot and sharp, blood soaking my sleeve. I retaliated with the remaining holy water, flinging it into her eyes. She shrieked, clawing at her face as it bubbled and smoked. Victor, meanwhile, had dispatched the burly one, snapping his neck with a brutal twist and then staking him through the heart with a shard of broken wood from the pillar. Black ash exploded outward, but Lucien and the agile one pressed their attack. Lucien landed a vicious punch to Victor's midsection, doubling him over. The agile vampire followed up with a kick that sent Victor crashing into the low table, shattering the crystal decanter. Red liquid, blood, spilled across the floor. I rushed to help, but the silver-haired female intercepted me, her vision impaired but her rage undimmed. "You'll die slow, mortal," she hissed, grabbing my throat. Her grip was iron, lifting me off the ground. Stars danced in my vision as air cut off. In desperation, I kicked wildly, my boot connecting with her knee. She buckled slightly, loosening her hold. I dropped, gasping, and snatched up a jagged stone from the debris. With a cry, I smashed it into her temple. She reeled, and I followed up by plunging the stake, retrieved from the ash, into her chest. She let out a final wail before crumbling to dust. 3 down. Victor was bleeding from multiple wounds, his suit torn but his eyes burned with determination. He grappled with the agile vampire, lifting him overhead and slamming him down onto the stone floor with enough force to crack the slabs. As the vampire struggled to rise, Victor stomped down, crushing his throat, then finished him with a stake improvised from a chair leg. Only Lucien remained. The leader circled Victor. Both panting, though vampires didn't need breath, the exertion showed in their slowed movements. "You can't protect them forever, Dragomir," Lucien taunted. "The Shadow War is upon us. Forces awakened in the fires of Hiroshima, fed by Chernobyl's poison, strengthened by every genocide since. They hunger for the end. And you're tired, I can see it." Victor wiped black ichor from his lip. "Tired, yes, but not done." He lunged, faster than before, fueled by whatever reserves he had left. They clashed in a frenzy of blows, claws rending flesh, fangs snapping. Lucien scored a deep gash across Victor's chest, but Victor countered by grabbing Lucien's arm and twisting it until bones snapped. With a roar, Victor forced Lucien to his knees, then drove his hand through the vampire's chest, ripping out his heart. Lucien's eyes bulged in disbelief before his body ignited from within, reducing to a pile of smoldering ash. The hall fell silent, save for my ragged breathing and the distant wind. Victor slumped against a wall, his wounds knitting slowly, black blood clotting. He looked at me, a mix of respect and weariness in his gaze. "You fought well, Elena. Not many mortals survive such an encounter." I collapsed into the remaining chair, my arm throbbing, adrenaline crashing. What was that about a shadow war? Victor straightened, wincing. The real conflict, not between nations or ideologies, but between forces born of humanity's darkest moments. Entities fed by despair, war, suffering, demons, if you will, though not in the biblical sense. They were stirred during the world wars, amplified in the Cold War. My kind's meddling only hastened their rise, and now they're stronger, plotting from the shadows. "Why tell me this?" I asked, retrieving my notebook from the backpack. Miraculously, it was intact. "Because the war is escalating," he said, his voice grave. "And I've decided my role must change. No more hiding in ruins like this. But remember, Elena, some truths are dangerous. They protect themselves." With that, he blurred into motion, vanishing into the night. I was left alone amid the ashes and ruins, the weight of his words and the battle pressing down. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. 3 days had passed since the chaos at Ponari Castle, but the memories haunted me like persistent ghosts. It was October 21, 2025, and I found myself in Budapest, Hungary, nursing my wounds in a dimly lit tavern called the Fagado Inn, tucked away in the historic Buda district. The place was a relic itself, wooden beams scarred by centuries, walls adorned with faded tapestries depicting medieval battles, and a hearth crackling with a fire that did little to ward off the chill in my bones. My arm, bandaged from the vampire's claws, throbbed with every movement, a constant reminder of the battle I'd barely survived. I'd fled Romania the morning after, crossing the border in a haze of exhaustion and disbelief. The climb down from Ponari had been agonizing, my body bruised and bloodied, but adrenaline had carried me to my SUV. I'd driven straight through the night, stopping only for fuel and to clean my wounds in a roadside motel. Now in Budapest, I sought solace in anonymity, far from the mountains and their secrets. The city buzzed with life, tourists snapping photos of the chain bridge, locals hurrying through the autumn drizzle, but I felt detached, as if the world had shifted on its axis. The Fagado Inn was quiet this evening, its patrons a mix of weary travelers and solitary drinkers. I sat at a corner table, my leather-bound notebook spread before me, a steaming mug of mulled wine in hand. The wine was rich, spiced with cinnamon and cloves, but it did little to steady my nerves. I'd spent the last 72 hours transcribing everything, from Victor's revelations to the brutal fight. My notes were frantic, pages filled with sketches of the vampires' faces, descriptions of their attacks, and Victor's parting words about the Shadow War. But something impossible was happening. As I wrote, the ink began to fade. At first I thought it was a trick of the dim light, but no, sentences I'd penned just moments ago dissolved like mist in sunlight, leaving blank pages behind. "Verdammt," I muttered under my breath, switching pens. Black ink, red ink, even a pencil borrowed from the bar. The result was the same. Words appeared solid, then vanished as if erased by an invisible hand. Single words like Victor, Troy, Ivan lingered, but any attempt to connect them into coherent narratives caused the text to evaporate. Frustration boiled over. I slammed the notebook shut, drawing a curious glance from the bartender, a stout woman in her 50s with a kind face and a name tag reading Anna. She approached, wiping her hands on a towel. "Everything all right, dear? You look like you've seen a specter. Another wine?" I forced a smile. "Please, and, Anna, have you ever heard of writing that disappears? Like secrets that can't be recorded?" She chuckled, pouring a fresh mug. "In Hungary, we have stories for everything. My grandmother spoke of Shelamuratok ghost writings, said certain beings like the vampirok from the old tales could curse knowledge so it stays in the mind but not on paper. Protects their secrets, you see, or maybe it's just bad ink." She winked, but her eyes held a knowing glint. "Worked here 20 years, seen strangers come in with wild eyes, muttering about the mountains. Transylvania's not far, and its shadows follow people." As she walked away, I stared into the fire, her words echoing Victor's warning. Some truths are dangerous, they protect themselves. Was this his doing? A spell woven into our conversation, ensuring his story remained oral, unprovable. In my decade of chasing the supernatural, I'd encountered glamours, illusions, even memory wipes, but nothing like this. It felt personal, as if Victor had trusted me with the burden but denied me the means to share it. The tavern's ancient television, mounted above the bar, droned in the background, Hungarian news with English subtitles scrolling at the bottom. I'd been ignoring it, lost in my futile transcription, but a shift in the anchor's tone caught my ear. Breaking news from the United Nations headquarters in New York, the female anchor said, her voice urgent. In a surprising development amid escalating global tensions, Secretary General Alvarez has announced the appointment of a new special advisor on global security and conflict resolution. I glanced up idly, more out of habit than interest. Politics wasn't my domain. I left that to the war correspondents while I hunted myths. But as the screen filled with footage of the UN Assembly Hall, delegates clapping politely, something froze me in place. The new advisor stepped to the podium, tall and imposing in a tailored suit, his raven hair swept back, pale skin stark under the bright lights. Those eyes, stormy, ancient, met the camera, and my mug slipped from my fingers, shattering on the wooden floor in a spray of wine and ceramic. "Oh, acute istenem," Anna exclaimed, rushing over with a broom. "You okay, dear?" Jumped like a cat on hot coals. I couldn't speak, my gaze locked on the screen. It was him, Viktor Dragomir, or whatever name he was using now. The subtitles confirmed it. Victor Kain, a renowned expert in international affairs with a background in historical conflict analysis, has been appointed effective immediately. Kain's classified service record includes advisory roles in multiple Cold War-era negotiations, though details remain undisclosed. Victor Kain, dramatic, fitting, like a shadow from myth. The anchor continued. This appointment comes as the world grapples with rising conflicts in Eastern Europe, cyber threats from rogue states, and environmental crises exacerbating resource wars. Kain is expected to address the Assembly tomorrow on strategies to avert what he calls existential shadows, a term sources say refers to unseen forces driving global instability. Anna mopped up the spill, eyeing me curiously. "Bad news, you look pale as death." "Something like that," I managed, my voice hoarse. "Can you turn up the volume?" She obliged, and the broadcast shifted to an interview clip with Kain, Victor speaking in flawless English. "The threats we face are not new," he said, his voice that same resonant timbre I'd heard in Ponari. "They are echoes of ancient patterns, war, plague, betrayal. But with modern tools they could end us all. My role is to illuminate these shadows, to guide humanity away from self-destruction." The irony was staggering. For 3 millennia he'd operated from the fringes, whispering to generals, sabotaging labs, eliminating threats in secret. Now he was stepping into the global spotlight, wielding influence over world leaders, intelligence agencies, and peacekeeping forces. As special advisor, he'd have access to classified briefings, nuclear protocols, even emerging tech like AI-driven warfare. Was this his change in role? No more lurking in castles. Now he'd shape policy from the heart of power. My mind reeled with implications. The shadow war he'd mentioned, those entities fed by human suffering, could he combat them more effectively from the UN? Or was this a darker turn? In Ponari, he'd confessed his weariness, his doubt in humanity's worth. "Perhaps it's time to let natural selection run its course," he'd said. What if this position wasn't about protection but control? A vampire at the helm of global security, enlightened despotism, as he described Dmitri's vision during the Cold War. Anna set a fresh mug before me. "Politics, eh? Always a mess. This kind fellow looks sharp, though, eyes like he's seen hell and back, better than the usual bureaucrats." If only she knew. He'd seen hells she couldn't imagine, the siege of Troy, the bubonic boils of Justinian's plague, the guillotines of Paris, the mushroom clouds of proxy wars. And now he was positioning himself to prevent or orchestrate the next apocalypse. I opened my notebook again, testing the curse. Victor Kain, UN advisor. The words faded almost immediately. Proof, if I needed it, that Victor controlled the narrative. Our encounter hadn't been random, it was a test. My questions, my survival in the battle, my reactions to his tales, they were evaluations. Had I passed? Was I now part of his web, a mortal ally in the coming storm? The broadcast ended with a teaser. Kain's first address tomorrow will outline responses to emerging threats, including unverified reports of anomalous activities in conflict zones. Anomalous activities, code for the supernatural, the shadow war spilling into the open. I paid my tab and stepped into the rainy Budapest night, the city's lights reflecting off wet cobblestones like scattered stars. Traffic hummed along the Danube, oblivious to the immortal now pulling strings from New York. Victor Kain, had evolved from guardian to gatekeeper. But whose side was he truly on? Humanity's, or his own vision of a controlled future? As I walked toward my hotel, rain mingling with my unspoken fears, I realized the interview was far from over. It had just entered a new, terrifying phase. The rain had softened to a drizzle as I trudged through Budapest's cobblestone streets, my boots splashing in shallow puddles that reflected the neon glow of the city. The weight of Viktor Dragomir's, now Victor Kain's, revelations pressed on me heavier than the damp air. It was October 22, 2025, just past midnight, and the world felt like it was teetering on an invisible edge. The Fagado Inn was behind me, its warm lights fading as I crossed the Széchenyi chain bridge, the Danube flowing dark and silent below. My hotel, a modest place near the Parliament building, was a short walk away, but my mind was miles distant, replaying every moment of Ponari Castle and the television broadcast that had turned my world upside down. My notebook, tucked inside my jacket, felt like a lead weight. I tried again before leaving the tavern, scribbling single words, shadow, war, Kain, but even those began to blur as if the paper itself rejected them. The curse, or whatever it was relentless. Victor had shared his story, entrusted me with truths that spanned millennia, only to ensure they could never be recorded. Why? Was it to protect himself, or to protect the world from the knowledge of what was coming? The shadow war he'd spoken of, entities born of humanity's darkest moments, growing stronger in the cracks of our conflicts, loomed in my thoughts like a storm on the horizon. I reached my hotel, a narrow building with a faded Art Nouveau facade, and climbed to my third-floor room. The space was small but clean, with a single window overlooking the river. I locked the door, double-checked the deadbolt, and sank onto the bed, my bandaged arm throbbing from the vampire's claw marks. The crucifix still hung around my neck, a cold comfort against the dread coiling in my gut. I pulled out the notebook again, flipping to a blank page. Maybe if I wrote in fragments, coded phrases, I could trick the curse. I tried. Troy intervened, Justinian burned, Livia betrayed, Kain rises. The words held for a heartbeat, then faded like smoke, leaving only the faintest ghost of ink. Verdammt noch mal, I whispered, tossing the pen aside. I leaned back against the headboard, staring at the ceiling. In my decade of chasing the supernatural, I'd never felt so powerless. Ghosts left traces, photographs, EMF spikes, temperature drops. Werewolves left claw marks, shed fur. Even witches left artifacts, runes etched in stone or ash. But Victor, he left nothing but memories, and those were a prison I couldn't escape. My thoughts drifted to the battle at Ponari. The speed, the violence, the sheer terror of facing creatures that moved like nightmares made flesh. I'd held my own, barely, with the holy water and stake, but only because Victor had been there, a force of destruction in his own right. His wounds, his weariness, the pain in his eyes when he spoke of Ivan and Livia, it was all too human for a being so far removed from mortality. And yet he'd chosen to step into the light, to take a role at the United Nations as Victor Kain. Why now? Why abandon the shadows after 3,000 years? I turned on the small television in the corner, hopping for distraction. The news channel was still covering Kain's appointment, looping footage from the UN press conference scheduled for later that morning. Analysts debated his mysterious background, his classified service record, and his cryptic references to existential shadows. One pundit, a bespectacled professor from Oxford, speculated wildly. Kain's terminology suggests a paradigm shift in security thinking, addressing not just geopolitical threats but intangible forces, perhaps psychological or cultural drivers of conflict. I snorted. If only they knew. Intangible forces, indeed entities fed by despair, growing in the wake of wars, famines, genocides. Victor had warned of their rise, and now he was positioned to confront them from the heart of global power. But his confession at Ponari haunted me. I'm beginning to wonder if I've only delayed the inevitable. Was he still humanity's guardian, or had he crossed a line into something else? A controller, a judge deciding who deserved to survive. The television flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw his face, those stormy eyes staring directly at me through the screen. I blinked and it was gone, replaced by a commercial for a Budapest river cruise. My pulse raced. Was he watching me? Had he been watching since I left Romania? The thought was paranoid, but after surviving a vampire ambush, paranoia felt like a survival skill. I stood and paced the small room, trying to piece together his motives. The interview hadn't been a confession, it was a test. My questions, about Troy, Justinian, the French Revolution, the Cold War, had forced him to articulate his purpose, to confront his own doubts. My survival in the battle, my refusal to cower, had proven something to him. But what? That I was worthy of carrying his story, even if I couldn't record it. Or that I was a potential ally in the Shadow War, a mortal who could navigate both worlds. A knock at the door jolted me from my thoughts. My hand instinctively went to the crucifix, my other reaching for the stake I'd kept beside the bed. "Who's there?" I called, my voice sharper than intended. "Room service," came a muffled reply, accented but calm. "Complimentary tea, courtesy of the management." I hadn't ordered anything. Suspicion flared, but I cracked the door, keeping the chain lock in place. A young man in a hotel uniform stood there, holding a tray with a porcelain teapot and a cup. His face was unremarkable, his eyes dull, too human to be a vampire. Still, I didn't relax. "Leave it outside," I said. He nodded, setting the tray on the floor, and walked away without a word. I waited a full minute before retrieving it, checking the pot for anything suspicious. It was just tea, steaming and fragrant with chamomile. But tucked beneath the saucer was a folded note, sealed with red wax stamped with a sigil, a stylized V entwined with thorns. My hands shook as I broke the seal. The note was written in elegant script, ink black as midnight. "Elena, you've seen the shadows and survived. The war is coming sooner than I feared. Watch the skis, listen to the whispers. You are not alone, but you must choose your path. VK." I dropped the note, my breath catching. It didn't fade, unlike my notebook entries, but the wax seal crumbled to dust as I touched it again. Victor was still out there, still pulling strings. Was this a warning or an invitation? Was I being recruited into his fight, or marked as a liability? I turned back to the television, now showing a weather forecast for Central Europe, clear skies, unusually warm for October. But Victor's words echoed, "Watch the skis." I stepped to the window, pulling back the curtain. The night was calm, the Danube shimmering under the city lights. Yet high above, a streak of unnatural green flickered across the sky, brief and gone before I could be sure it was real. A meteor, a drone, or something else, something tied to the forces he'd warned about. Sleep was impossible now. I sat at the small desk, staring at the blank notebook. The story was locked in my mind. Victor's millennia of sacrifice, his betrayal by Ivan and Livia, the battle at Ponari, his rise as Victor Kain. I was the only mortal who knew the truth, and that knowledge was both a privilege and a curse. I couldn't publish it, couldn't prove it, but I could watch. I could listen. And maybe, just maybe, I could choose. The world was changing, faster than anyone realized. Victor had stepped from the shadows into a position of unimaginable power. Was he humanity's last hope, wielding his ancient wisdom to steer us from extinction? Or was he, as Lucian had taunted, too tired to care, ready to let us face the consequences of our own hubris? The Shadow War was real, and I was now entangled in it, whether I wanted to be or not. I closed the notebook and slipped the note from Victor into my pocket. Outside, Budapest slept, unaware of the immortal now shaping its fate from thousands of miles away. The question wasn't just whether humanity deserved to survive, as Victor had mused in Ponari. It was whether I, Elena Voss, could live with the choices I'd have to make in the days ahead. As dawn crept over the horizon, painting the river gold, I made a silent vow. I'd keep watching, keep listening, waiting for signs of Victor's influence or his betrayal. The war, as he'd said, was just beginning. And I, a mere mortal with a notebook full of fatting truths, was now part of it.